What began as a peaceful Thanksgiving night stroll turned into a terrifying encounter that still haunts me to this day. We thought our town was safe until that car appeared. 5 years ago, on Thanksgiving night, my friend Alex and I experienced something we'll never forget. I was a junior in high school, and I had decided to spend the evening at Alex's house. We had been close friends since middle school, often taking nighttime walks around our small town. That night, after dinner and watching the NFL game, we set out for a stroll, just like we always did. Our town, home to about 15,000 people, had a low crime rate. Nothing major ever really happened, so we felt safe even as late as 11:30 p.m. We walked through Alex's familiar neighborhood, heading down Main Street, our usual route. The cool air and quiet streets made the night seem calm until a car passed us. At first, we didn't think much of it. The car continued down the street, but then it turned around at the end and came back in our direction. Something about the way it slowed down caught our attention. Alex and I exchanged a tense glance as the car stopped on the side of the road. The engine idled, but nobody got out. We continued walking, our steps quickening as unease settled over us. The car wasn't parked in front of a house or a store, just an empty stretch of road. Suddenly, the car roared to life again, reversing at an alarming speed directly toward us. Panic set in, and we darted into the woods on our left. The forest wasn't large, but it was thick enough to give us cover. We ran about 15 feet in and stopped, crouching low behind the dense foliage. Through the branches, we watched in silence as the car screeched to a halt at the spot where we'd been moments before. The passenger side door opened, and a man stepped out. In the dim light, I couldn't make out his features clearly, but he hesitated and scanned the woods. It was clear he was looking for us. My heart pounded as I held my breath, afraid he might come after us. For a moment, he seemed to consider entering the woods, but then he turned back, got into the car, and drove away. Alex and I stayed hidden for a little while longer, listening for any signs of the car's return. When we felt it was safe, we crept back toward Alex's house, avoiding the main roads by cutting through backyards. To this day, we don't know what that man's intentions were, whether it was a prank, an attempted mugging, or something far worse. What I do know is that our instinct to run likely saved us. After that night, Alex and I still went on walks, but we never left the house without carrying small knives for protection. That Thanksgiving night taught us to always trust our instincts, even in a town where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. What would you do if a friendly neighbor turned out to be someone who shouldn't even be there? This seemingly ordinary Thanksgiving walk took a sinister twist that I'll never forget. When I was 14, Thanksgiving at my aunt and uncle's house was a yearly tradition. Their home was about 20 minutes from ours, set in a quiet, rural neighborhood with large properties and plenty of space between houses. It was the perfect place for family gatherings, and I always looked forward to spending the day there. This particular Thanksgiving was no different. After arriving in the early afternoon, my family and I joined the rest of the relatives who were already chatting and enjoying themselves. My aunt and uncle had a dog I loved, and since I didn't have any pets of my own, I was always happy to take care of him during our visits. A few hours after we'd arrived, I noticed the dog sitting near the front door, clearly wanting to go outside. I asked my uncle if I could take him for a walk, and he agreed. He reminded me that the dog was trained to stay within the electric fence surrounding the property, as he had a habit of chasing squirrels and wandering off. With leash in hand, I headed out with the dog, strolling down the long driveway and into the yard. As I stood there, letting the dog sniff around, a man appeared walking down the street. It struck me as unusual since the neighborhood was typically quiet and there were no sidewalks. He was short and stocky, with a goatee and a blue jacket. When he saw me, he waved and walked up the driveway. He greeted me with a friendly hi and asked if I was visiting for Thanksgiving. I replied yes, and he claimed to be the next-door neighbor, pointing toward a property obscured by trees. Then he mentioned that he'd recently borrowed a wheelbarrow and some tools from my uncle and asked if I could go retrieve them from his garage. At first I agreed, but then I realized I'd need both hands to carry a wheelbarrow, and I couldn't let the dog run loose because of the electric fence. I told the man I'd take the dog back inside first, and then help him. However, he immediately objected, offering to hold the leash instead. That didn't sit right with me. I politely told him I'd be quick and headed back toward the house. Once inside, I found my uncle and told him about the man. To my surprise, my uncle looked confused and asked which neighbor I was referring to. When I pointed toward the property the man had gestured at, my uncle's expression darkened. He explained that those neighbors were out of town for Thanksgiving and added that he hadn't lent any tools or a wheelbarrow to anyone. Alarmed, my uncle decided to investigate. He and I went back outside, but by the time we got there, the man was gone. We walked down the driveway and toward the neighboring house the man had claimed was his. The garage door was wide open, and inside, some items appeared to be in disarray. My uncle called out, but there was no response. Knowing the actual homeowners were meticulous, my uncle suspected someone had broken in. We returned to the house and called the police. When they arrived, they confirmed that the garage door had been pried open and that some items had been disturbed, but the intruder was nowhere to be found. That night, we didn't see the man again, and I shudder to think about what might have happened if I'd gone with him to the garage. I'm grateful I trusted my instincts and told my uncle. While the man was never caught, that Thanksgiving left me with a chilling reminder to always be cautious, even with someone who seems friendly. Spending Thanksgiving alone in an empty dorm seemed uneventful until a stranger followed me home. What happened next was beyond terrifying. During my first semester as a college freshman, I spent Thanksgiving alone in my dorm room. I was an international student, and traveling home for the short break wasn't financially possible. By then, I hadn't made any close friends, especially none who would invite me to their family's Thanksgiving dinner. The entire campus was eerily silent, as most students had gone home for the holiday. On Thanksgiving night, boredom set in. I had spent the entire day inside, and the silence of my room felt oppressive. I thought about ordering takeout, but decided to stretch my legs and venture out. A small Chinese restaurant a few blocks from campus was open, so I bundled up and headed into the cold, snowy night. The restaurant was cozy, and the food was good. After finishing my meal, I lingered for a while, scrolling through my phone and enjoying the warmth. Eventually, I headed back to my dorm, taking the same quiet streets I had walked earlier. As I walked, I got the unnerving feeling that someone was following me. I glanced over my shoulder, but couldn't see anyone clearly. I quickened my pace, trying to appear calm while my heart raced. When I finally reached my dorm building, I sprinted up the stairs, fumbling with my key card as I hurriedly unlocked the door and slammed it shut behind me. Looking back through the peephole, I saw a man standing in the foyer of the building. He wasn't trying to enter. Instead, he acted like he was just there to get warm. Feeling slightly relieved, I locked my door and settled into my room. Hours passed, and I convinced myself that the man had left. Around midnight, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard my doorknob jiggle. My heart stopped as I realized someone was trying to open my door. Then came a knock. I quietly approached the peephole and saw the same man from earlier. He had somehow entered the building and was now standing outside my room. Panic washed over me, but I knew I couldn't let him know I was inside. I stayed silent, hoping he'd move on. After a tense few minutes, he finally left. Not long after, I heard a commotion down the hall. Unable to contain my curiosity, I peeked outside and saw 2 campus security officers wrestling the man to the ground. A shaken student with blood on their face stood nearby, clearly the victim of an assault. Later, one of the officers explained that the man had been knocking on dorm doors, testing if they were unlocked. When he found an open door, he forced his way in and attacked the student inside. Thankfully, the security team arrived in time to stop him before things escalated further. Looking back, I'm grateful I had the presence of mind to lock my door and call campus security as soon as I suspected something was wrong. That night taught me a harsh lesson about staying alert and cautious, even in a seemingly secure environment. It wasn't the quiet Thanksgiving I had envisioned, it was one I'll never forget. A peaceful Thanksgiving retreat at our family cabin turned into a nightmare when an intruder arrived during a blinding snowstorm. What happened next left us questioning our safety forever. Last Thanksgiving, my family decided to spend the holiday at our cabin for a change. The drive was longer than usual due to heavy snowfall, but we didn't mind. The weather radar had predicted light snow for the following days, so we felt prepared. We arrived at the cabin just as night fell. While my parents prepared dinner, my siblings and I worked on getting the place ready. We lit candles and pulled out board games to pass the time since there were no TVs at the cabin. As we sat down to eat, the wind outside picked up, howling against the windows. It quickly escalated into a full-blown snowstorm, something we hadn't anticipated. By the next morning, snow had piled high around the cabin, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. We were trapped and had no choice but to spend another night there. As darkness fell on the second night, the power went out. We lit more candles and tried to make the best of the situation, but the sense of isolation grew heavier. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I began hearing strange noises. At first, I thought it was just the storm gusts of wind and snow shifting against the cabin, but soon, the sounds grew louder. I heard thuds and scraping noises that seemed deliberate. Lying in my sleeping bag, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the back of the cabin. I froze, glancing at my parents, who were still asleep. Gathering courage, I decided to check it out. Creeping toward the back door, I noticed snow piled against the windows, obscuring my view. But as I peered outside, I caught movement through the swirling snow. A figure was approaching the cabin, carrying what looked like a large log or piece of wood. My stomach dropped. I bolted upstairs to wake my parents. As I reached their room, the banging on the door intensified. Whoever was outside was now trying to force their way in. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the cabin as the person hammered at the lock. My dad grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar, while my mom called the police. We huddled together, keeping out of sight from the door, as the banging continued. The door began to give way, splintering near the lock. Just as we feared it would break, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway cut through the chaos. The police had arrived. Upon seeing their flashing lights, the intruder fled into the woods. The officers didn't attempt to follow, given the intensity of the snowstorm. When daylight finally came, we assessed the damage. The lock and door were severely damaged, but they had held long enough to protect us. The most chilling discovery came when we realized the power outage wasn't caused by the storm. The intruder had deliberately cut the power line to the cabin. We never found out who the person was or why they targeted us, but the incident left us shaken. Shortly after, my family decided to sell the cabin. The memories of that Thanksgiving night and the lingering questions were too much to bear. A routine Thanksgiving trip to the store turned into a spine-chilling encounter when a strange woman wouldn't stop watching me. What happened next left me questioning my safety. It was the day before Thanksgiving, and my family was preparing for our annual dinner at my grandparents' house. I had been out visiting a high school friend earlier that day when my mom texted me, asking if I could pick up a few items from the supermarket on my way home. By the time I arrived at the store, it was around 6 p.m., and the place was packed. The parking lot was so full that I had to park at the far end, walking a good distance to get inside. I didn't have a long list of items to buy, but the crowded aisles made it a slow process. As I wandered through the store, I noticed a woman standing near the frozen food section, staring directly at me. Her gaze was intense and unwavering, almost like a laser. I didn't recognize her and had no idea why she was looking at me. Feeling unsettled, I quickly looked away and continued shopping, trying to brush it off. A little while later, in a completely different part of the store, I spotted the same woman again. She wasn't shopping, she was just standing there, staring at me. My unease grew, but I decided not to confront her. Instead, I focused on finishing my shopping as quickly as possible. Eventually, I made my way to the checkout line. After paying for my items, I walked out to the parking lot, relieved to be heading home. I loaded the groceries into the trunk of my car, got into the driver's seat, and started the engine. That's when I heard a knock on the front passenger window. I turned to see the same woman standing there, holding a $20 bill in her hand. She gestured for me to roll down the window, claiming I had dropped the money in the parking lot. Her story didn't add up. I was certain I hadn't dropped any cash, especially since I rarely carried any. Still, I rolled the window down slightly, trying to be polite while keeping my guard up. When I told her I didn't think the $20 was mine, she insisted, pushing the bill closer to me. Her persistence felt strange, and her demeanor made me increasingly uncomfortable. Then, without warning, she started climbing into my car through the passenger window. Panicking, I turned off the engine, grabbed my keys, and jumped out of the car. I backed away, pulling out my phone to call the police. From a safe distance, I watched as the woman, now inside my car, seemed to fumble around for a moment before quickly getting out and running off into the night. When the police arrived, the woman was long gone. Fortunately, she hadn't stolen anything from my car, likely because I didn't have much of value inside. However, the officers suspected she might have been trying to steal the car itself or force me to drive her somewhere. To this day, I don't know what her intentions were, but that night left me shaken. What seemed like a harmless trip to the supermarket turned into a chilling reminder to always stay vigilant, even in the most mundane situations. A restless Thanksgiving night led me to explore an old barn on my grandparents' property. What I discovered inside turned the holiday into a horrifying mystery. Thanksgiving had always been a family affair at my grandparents' small farm. As a teenager, however, I found the gatherings increasingly dull. The adult conversations about mundane topics were of no interest to me. After an early Thanksgiving dinner, I decided to escape the chatter by wandering the property, eager for some time alone. Eventually, I found myself at the old barn. My grandparents rarely used it anymore, and it mostly served as a storage space. The barn door was weathered but surprisingly easy to open. They never locked it, assuming there was nothing valuable inside worth stealing. Once inside, I realized how dark it was. Using my phone's flashlight, I illuminated the space, revealing old tools, rusted equipment, and cobwebs hanging from the rafters. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and dust, adding to the eerie atmosphere. As I explored, I came across a small hatchet lying on a workbench. Its blade was rusted and covered in dried blood. My grandparents didn't have any animals on the farm anymore, but I remembered stories about how they used to butcher livestock. Even so, seeing the blood-stained tool made me uneasy. Curious and a little spooked, I climbed the creaky wooden stairs to the barn's loft. The upper level was cluttered with old hay bales, scattered in disarray. As I stepped further in, my foot hit something solid under the hay. I brushed the hay aside with my foot, and what I uncovered nearly made me fall backward in shock. There, staring up at me with empty eye sockets, was a long dead corpse. The skeletal remains were partially buried in the hay, their presence a gruesome secret hidden for years. Heart pounding, I sprinted out of the barn and back to the house. Bursting into the room where my family was gathered, I interrupted their conversation to tell them what I had found. My dad and uncle, skeptical but concerned, decided to investigate. When they returned, their pale faces confirmed my story. My grandparents were horrified and immediately called the sheriff. The investigation revealed that the body had been there for about 3 years. The skeleton bore multiple hatchet wounds, and the realization hit me like a brick I had touched the murder weapon earlier while exploring. The discovery left my grandparents in shock. They couldn't believe they had lived on the farm for years without knowing a body was hidden in their barn. The identity of the man and the circumstances of his death remained a mystery. Despite an extensive investigation, no leads ever surfaced. To this day, nobody knows who killed him or why. What began as a restless Thanksgiving evening turned into a chilling experience that still haunts me. A random stranger in your home, would you confront them or call for help? What began as a cheerful Thanksgiving gathering took a chilling turn when I realized an uninvited guest was among us. Thanksgiving at my house is usually a lively event. My wife and I host, and between our parents, siblings, and extended family, we typically have 15 to 20 people over for dinner. It's always a fun and bustling holiday filled with conversation, laughter, and delicious food. Last year, as the guests began arriving in the early afternoon, the house quickly filled with the buzz of activity. I was moving between the kitchen and the living room, helping my wife with preparations and catching up with family. At one point, as I walked back into the living room, I noticed something strange. Among the familiar faces of my family, there was one man I didn't recognize. He stood awkwardly, looking around as if he didn't quite belong. Confused, I approached one of my uncles and asked if he knew who the man was. My uncle explained that the man had arrived at the same time as they did and claimed to be a good friend of mine. That immediately raised a red flag. I didn't know this man at all. Determined to find out what was going on, I began walking toward him. However, as soon as he saw me heading his way, he turned and quickly went upstairs. Alarm bells went off in my head because nobody else was upstairs, and there was no reason for him to be up there. I followed him, climbing the stairs to find all the doors closed, just as they had been earlier. I called out, asking who was there, but got no response. Slowly, I opened the door to the guest bedroom, but it was empty. Moving down the hall, I reached our master bedroom. The door was locked. My heart sank as I realized the stranger must be inside. I knocked, demanding he come out, but there was no reply. Feeling uneasy, I went back downstairs and told my wife and a few other family members what had happened. We decided to call the police, unsure of who this man was or what his intentions might be. While we waited for the police to arrive, the man remained locked in our bedroom. It was an agonizing wait, knowing he was just upstairs, but we didn't want to risk confronting him ourselves. When the police finally arrived, they coaxed the man out of the room and detained him. It turned out he wasn't armed, but his behavior was erratic, and he refused to explain why he had entered our house or locked himself in our bedroom. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. The memory of him blending into our Thanksgiving gathering, only to disappear upstairs, still sends chills down my spine. That Thanksgiving taught me to be more cautious, even during joyful family celebrations. What started as a fun Thanksgiving tradition took a sinister turn when we stepped into an abandoned house. We uncovered something horrifying that still haunts me to this day. Every Thanksgiving, my extended family treated the holiday as both a feast and a reunion. The gathering always took place at my aunt's house, which was the largest and best suited for the event. Though the house comfortably accommodated many of us, it still felt crowded every year. After dinner, the younger kids would usually gather upstairs or in the basement while the adults stayed on the main floor. I was a teenager at the time, and not many of my cousins were my age, so I preferred hanging out with the adults. They often shared funny stories and jokes, which I found more entertaining. That year, something strange happened. My Uncle Bobby, who had just stepped inside after a smoke, looked visibly tense. His grin was forced, and I could tell something was bothering him. Uncle Bobby was a former military man, and I'd seen that expression before it meant something serious was on his mind. Curious, I tugged at his arm and pestered him until he agreed to tell me what was going on. He pointed across the street to an old, decrepit house. I had heard plenty of stories about that house growing up. Every time we visited my aunt's place, my parents and the other adults warned me to stay away from it. Uncle Bobby admitted that when he was younger, he and my dad, along with two of their friends, had explored the house. Now the group wanted to check it out again, and I somehow convinced them to let me tag along. The house loomed like a ghostly shadow, its peeling paint and broken windows giving it an unsettling vibe. As we approached, the air felt colder, and my excitement was replaced by unease. Inside, the walls were covered in strange drawings. They weren't graffiti, they seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. Bobby led us into the kitchen, where the room's centerpiece made my stomach churn. A pentagram was scrawled on the floor, surrounded by the carcasses of small animals. The smell was overpowering, and I realized the remains were fresh, maybe only a day or two old. Despite my fear, the adults insisted on exploring further. They decided to check the basement, and I reluctantly followed. The stairs were narrow and creaky, leading to a dimly lit space that felt even more ominous than the chaos above. The basement floor was scattered with cans of food and makeshift sleeping mats, suggesting someone had been living there. In the center of the room stood a single propane heater, and in one corner was a pile of bones. They looked like chicken bones, or at least I hoped they were. It was clear that whoever had been staying here wasn't far removed from the disturbing rituals upstairs. The adults finally decided it was time to leave. We'd only been there for about 5 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. As we headed for the front door, I heard something that made my blood run cold, light footsteps coming from the second floor. We didn't stick around to investigate. Instead, we hurried back across the street to my aunt's house, locking the doors behind us. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Years later, I learned the truth about that house. There had been a cult operating in the area years before, known for breaking into farms to steal livestock for their rituals. According to local rumors, one member of the cult, a woman people dubbed the Wicked Witch of the East, had started abducting people. While authorities eventually caught 2 of her accomplices, the woman herself was never found. To this day, I don't know if she or anyone else was in the house that night. Perhaps it was just a shelter used by the cult occasionally. What I do know is that we stumbled upon something far darker than we could have imagined. That Thanksgiving will forever remain one of the most chilling nights of my life. What would you do if a random man showed up at your family's Thanksgiving gathering and refused to leave? This chilling encounter made us rethink how safe we really were. Thanksgiving at my aunt and uncle's house was always a big event. Their large property and spacious home made it the perfect venue for hosting our extended family. The neighborhood had a private feel, with big lots and houses spread far apart, so we never worried about strangers intruding on our gatherings. That year, the day was unfolding as usual. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and other relatives filled the house, chatting and laughing. The living room was packed with people watching football, while others mingled in the dining room, preparing for the feast. At one point, I overheard whispers coming from the dining room. A few people were talking about a man standing in the yard. Curious, I walked over to the window to see for myself. Sure enough, there was a man outside, slowly walking toward the house. The property wasn't fenced, but it was unusual for someone to wander onto it uninvited. As I watched, the man moved toward the sliding glass door that led to the basement. Luckily, the door was locked, and he couldn't get in. The sight of the man unsettled everyone. After standing near the basement door for a moment, he began walking away, disappearing behind a tree at the edge of the yard. We all hoped that was the end of it, but our relief was short-lived. About half an hour later, there was a knock at the front door. My uncle opened it to find the same man standing there. He claimed he was at the wrong address, explaining that he was trying to meet a friend for Thanksgiving and thought this was their house. While the story seemed plausible, the man's behavior didn't. Why had he gone to the basement door earlier instead of knocking on the front door? My uncle politely sent him on his way, and we tried to move past the strange encounter. As the evening wore on, most of us forgot about the man until someone spotted him again. This time he was standing at the edge of the woods behind the yard. It was dark by now, but his silhouette was clearly visible. He seemed to be watching the house. For several minutes he just stood there, partially obscured by a tree. Then, without warning, he sprinted across the yard and vanished into the darkness. The rest of the night was tense, but the man didn't return. To this day, we have no idea who he was or what his intentions were. Was he truly lost, or was he planning something sinister? That Thanksgiving left us all feeling uneasy, a stark reminder that even in the safest neighborhoods, you can never be too careful. When I went to pick up some groceries before Thanksgiving, I never imagined a seemingly normal trip to the store would turn into a terrifying encounter with a stranger. What happened next still haunts me. The day before Thanksgiving, I had planned to visit my high school friend and then stop by the grocery store to pick up a few things for my family. The store was packed with people, everyone scrambling to get last-minute items for the holiday. I parked at the far end of the lot because it was so crowded and made my way inside. The aisles were cramped, but I didn't mind. I only had a few items to grab. As I moved through the store, trying to get in and out quickly, I couldn't help but notice a woman standing near the frozen food section. She was staring directly at me. Her gaze was intense and unblinking, which made me feel uneasy. I didn't recognize her at all, and I couldn't understand why she was watching me so closely. I tried to shake it off and focused on my shopping. However, every time I moved to a different aisle, there she was still staring. It wasn't just a passing glance, she was intentionally watching me, no matter where I went in the store. I started to feel nervous. Why was she acting like this? Finally, I decided to finish my shopping and head to the checkout. As I approached the front of the store, I didn't see her anymore, which was a relief. I quickly paid for my items and left, thinking the weirdness was over. But as I was loading my groceries into the back of my car, I heard a knock on the passenger side window. I looked up, startled, and saw the same woman standing there, holding a $20 bill. She said, "You dropped this." I was confused. I was pretty sure I hadn't dropped any money, especially not a $20 bill. I told her I didn't think it was mine, but she insisted, saying she had seen me drop it in the parking lot. At that point, I started to feel even more uneasy. I never carried much cash, and I was certain I didn't have a $20 on me. I said, "No, it's not mine," but she didn't seem to want to accept that. She pressed the bill closer to me, her face too close to the window. Then, without warning, she began climbing into my car through the passenger window. Panic shot through me. I quickly turned off the engine, grabbed my keys, and bolted out of the car. I ran to a safe distance, pulling out my phone to call the police. I watched as the woman sat in my car for a moment, then, as quickly as she had entered, she got out and ran off into the parking lot. I waited for the police, but by the time they arrived, the woman was gone. I told them what happened, but they couldn't find her. The strangest part of the whole ordeal was that she hadn't stolen anything from my car, and I didn't have anything of real value inside. It's as if she wanted something else. Maybe she planned to steal the car, or maybe she had another sinister goal. I don't know. All I know is that I'll never forget that woman and how she made a simple grocery trip into a terrifying experience. From that day on, I've been far more cautious in situations that once felt completely normal. What started as a warm, rainy Thanksgiving dinner turned into a terrifying fight for survival when a stranger at the door wasn't just asking for food. Stick around as this family's quick thinking exposes the real danger that lurks closer to home than you'd expect. It was a rainy Thanksgiving, a day meant for comfort and gratitude. Our family is small, so gatherings are usually intimate. This year, it was just my mom, my two sisters, our grandparents, and me at my mom's house. My older sister, Nancy, had been living on her own for years, while my younger sister, Jamie, and I still lived at home. Our grandparents lived about 20 minutes away, and our father's side of the family resided in another town. We were all busy with preparations. Mom, my sisters, and I worked in the kitchen, while Grandma brought over additional dishes to complete the feast. Thanksgiving dinner was always set for 6 p.m. sharp. Our grandparents arrived an hour early, braving the downpour, so we helped them up the slick front steps to avoid any mishaps. Once inside, the rain provided a cozy backdrop to our evening. The football game was on in the living room, and Grandpa and I settled in to watch, as he was a die-hard Cowboys fan. Meanwhile, Mom and my sisters handled the finishing touches in the kitchen. Despite the gloomy weather, everything felt relaxed and festive at first. At 6 p.m., as per tradition, we gathered at the table. The meal was a feast turkey, leg of lamb, potatoes, stuffing, cornbread, cranberry sauce, and much more. After eating, we moved to the living room, continuing to watch football while enjoying wine and conversation. Then, the doorbell rang. It was still pouring outside, and we weren't expecting anyone else. "Oh no, what if it's your father?" Mom said, though our parents didn't get along. It wasn't entirely out of the question that he might show up unannounced. Mom asked me to check the door. I yelled through the door. Who is it? But the rain on the awning drowned out the response. I opened the main door slightly, but left the storm door locked. Standing there was a man dressed in an oversized raincoat with the hood pulled up. He stepped closer and shouted something, but I had to ask him to repeat himself several times before understanding he was asking for food. He even added, "The Lord will bless you for your kindness." I felt torn, but I went to ask Mom. Grandma immediately suggested we help him. Hesitant but feeling influenced by Grandma's generosity, I made a plate of leftovers, layering it between paper plates to protect it from the rain. Returning to the door, I held up the plate, showing him I was offering food. That's when everything changed. As soon as I unlocked the storm door to hand him the plate, he yanked the door open and tried to force his way inside. Instinctively, I threw the plate at him and shoved back, yelling for my sisters. Nancy rushed to help, and together we slammed the door shut just as I saw two other men running toward the house. My heart pounded as I raced to lock the back door, shouting instructions to my panicked family. Mom called the police while I kept watch, peering out windows into the rain-soaked darkness. Through the backyard window, I spotted two men running, presumably after failing to break in through the back door. Then they disappeared into the storm. When the police arrived, the scattered food I had thrown still lay on the front porch, a haunting reminder of how close we'd come to disaster. The men clearly hadn't been after food, confirming our worst fears. Thanksgiving could have ended in tragedy if not for our quick reactions. Grandma's intentions were pure, and I don't blame her for wanting to help. However, this experience taught us a harsh truth sometimes. Even acts of kindness can put you in danger. We installed a doorbell camera the very next day. A quiet Thanksgiving evening turns into a nightmare as a young woman's online stalker crosses the digital boundary and invades her life. What happens next will send chills down your spine. Stay tuned to see how she confronts this dangerous ordeal. It was Thanksgiving night, and I was at my parents' house for dinner. They were hosting this year, and it was a chance to see cousins and uncles I hadn't seen in almost a year. It was the usual Thanksgiving gathering, with my parents cooking a big meal and the family catching up. Before dinner, I received a long, unsolicited text from an unknown number. I won't share the exact message because it included a lot of personal details, but it began with, "Hey Melissa, hope your Thanksgiving is going well." It didn't take long for me to realize who had sent it. It was Kevin, a stalker I had never met in person. We matched on a dating app once, and though we texted and exchanged snaps for a while, we never met. Kevin gave off obsessive vibes, and when I politely declined to go on a date with him, he became even more aggressive. He even threatened me once after seeing a snap story of me having drinks with a friend, thinking I was on a date. That's when I blocked him on Snapchat, Instagram, and even his phone number. Blocking him didn't stop the harassment. He created random Instagram and Snapchat accounts, all with 0 followers, to try to contact me. Each time I blocked those too. His persistence was disturbing. The text I received that night was long and unsettling. It alternated between gaslighting me and borderline threats. I spent a long time crafting my reply, ultimately deciding to write, "If you keep contacting me, I will go to the police." I sent the message and tried to put the situation out of my mind. My grandma, annoyed with how much time I was spending on my phone, urged me to focus on the family gathering. For a brief while I succeeded, putting the situation out of sight and out of mind. Half an hour later, my phone buzzed again. Another essay-like text from yet another unknown number appeared. I refused to let it ruin my mood and decided to deal with it later. When the family began to leave and things quieted down, I finally read it. The new message was even worse, longer than the first and filled with insults and manipulative language. He acted like an entitled, narcissistic sociopath. I showed the messages to the remaining family members. They were horrified. My mom insisted I go to the police the next day to report him for harassment, which I planned to do. After dinner, I returned to my apartment, a unit on the lower floor of a two-family house that I shared with my roommate, Chelsea. She wasn't home yet, so I went straight to my room, hoping to wind down with a Christmas movie. Not long after, my phone started ringing. It was an unknown number, and I knew it had to be Kevin. I declined the call and silenced my phone, trying to focus on the movie. I was watching Surviving Christmas, a light-hearted rom-com I'd chosen to fall asleep to. Halfway through the movie, I heard footsteps outside my room. They weren't coming from the floor above, they were inside the apartment. I assumed it was Chelsea returning home, so I wasn't alarmed at first. The footsteps approached my bedroom door, and then I heard the doorknob rattle as if someone was trying to open it. My habit of locking my bedroom door every night, even when home alone, now felt like the best decision I'd ever made. I called out, "Chelsea," but there was no response. The footsteps retreated quietly. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone. Before I could dial Chelsea, I noticed a series of texts from another unknown number. One message stood out, "Good thing you made it obvious where you live." I immediately tried calling Chelsea, but she didn't answer. Panicked, I called my parents. My dad picked up, and I whispered into the phone that I thought Kevin was in the apartment. He told me to stay put and promised he'd be there in minutes. While waiting, Chelsea finally called back, and I explained what had happened. She told me she wasn't coming home that night, confirming that the footsteps hadn't been hers. My fear deepened as I waited for my dad. When he arrived, the front door was locked, so I let him in. I insisted I hadn't imagined what had happened. We checked the apartment thoroughly and found nothing until my dad went to the kitchen. He discovered the large sliding window wide open. It was big enough for anyone to climb through. I hadn't locked it. My dad scolded me, disappointed that such a simple oversight could have allowed someone to enter. I packed an overnight bag and went home with my dad, unable to stay in the apartment. The next morning, we went to the county court's office to begin the process of getting a restraining order. The staff gave us step-by-step instructions for filing a temporary order. Eventually, I saw Kevin in person when the court date for the restraining order extension came. The judge reviewed the evidence, including his threatening texts, and granted the extension. While I couldn't prove he had broken into my apartment, the messages alone were enough to hold him accountable. If Kevin ever contacts me again through any means, he will face arrest. This man was truly dangerous, and I can only hope he hasn't moved on to harass someone else. What starts as a lively Thanksgiving celebration by the lake takes a sinister turn when mysterious figures begin lurking in the shadows. Stay with this chilling tale as one family realizes they're not alone in the dark, and it might already be too late. Most of my family lives in a rural part of Central Florida, closer to the East Coast. One year, my Uncle Ben hosted Thanksgiving at his house, which sits by a large lake with only about 5 other houses nearby. For privacy reasons, I won't name the lake or town, but it's a quiet and remote area. The house itself isn't what you'd call fancy. It's rustic but spacious and private. My uncle, being a bit of a redneck, always makes our holiday gatherings lively and fun. When Uncle Ben hosts, he goes all out, transforming the holiday into more of a party than a formal dinner. This year was no exception. There was music, cornhole, and coolers full of beer. We arrived at his house around 3 p.m. The festivities began immediately with drinks, snacks, and games. We played cards, cornhole, and even some basketball with my cousin, though the basketball didn't last long with all the beer and chips we'd consumed. This went on for hours with music blasting in the background. It wasn't your typical Thanksgiving celebration, but it was what we loved about spending time at Uncle Ben's. Around 5:30 p.m., as the sun began to set, Aunt Mel and Uncle Ben started bringing food to the table they'd set up under the large gazebo in the yard. The gazebo was equipped with lights, so when it got dark by 6 p.m., the lights came on, illuminating our outdoor feast. It was pitch black outside the gazebo by this point, but we enjoyed the atmosphere. Uncle Ben is probably the only person who insists on eating Thanksgiving dinner outdoors, but we didn't mind. It always added to the fun. The mood shifted suddenly when my cousin pointed toward the woods and asked, "Dad, who's that?" Uncle Ben turned around, startled, and replied, "Who the hell?" There was a man standing at the edge of the woods, perfectly still, watching us. Uncle Ben stood up and began walking toward the figure, calling out, "Can I help you with something?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he turned and ran into the woods as Uncle Ben got halfway there. My uncle, slightly drunk by now, found humor in the situation and laughed as he returned to the table. "Must be one of the local nuts," he said. Aunt Mel wasn't as amused, and I couldn't shake the eerie feeling. Who would stand there watching us like that? Not long after, I spotted him again. This time the man was closer to the lake, but still at the edge of the woods. I pointed him out to everyone. Uncle Ben, now visibly irritated, stood up again and marched toward the man, yelling and taunting him. But as Uncle Ben approached, we noticed another man on the opposite side of the yard, partially concealed by the woods. When the first man ran back into the trees, the second one remained for a moment before also retreating. At this point, the tension was palpable. My dad, cousin, and I got up to support Uncle Ben, but by the time we moved, both men had disappeared. We decided to start cleaning up. The festive mood was gone, replaced by unease. We brought all the food and plates inside and retreated to the living room. Uncle Ben left the gazebo lights on, likely to discourage the men from coming back. He and Aunt Mel were on high alert, keeping watch. These weren't kids playing pranks, they were adults, and their behavior didn't make any sense. Our best guess was that it might have been some drunk teenagers or young adults with nowhere else to go for Thanksgiving, but it still felt unnerving. Later, I got up to grab another beer from the cooler outside. My dad and Uncle Ben asked me to bring back drinks for them too, so I walked out to the gazebo alone. As I approached the cooler, I suddenly felt uneasy. The light over the gazebo was off now, and the darkness seemed heavier than before. I grabbed as many beers as I could carry, eager to return to the safety of the house. Just as I turned to leave, I heard the sound of a chair scraping against the concrete floor of the gazebo. My heart froze. I looked back and saw a man walking around the table under the gazebo. He was tall, at least 6'8". I bolted toward the house, yelling for Uncle Ben. My dad and uncle rushed outside as I pointed toward the gazebo. Then, as if in response to my shouting, there was a loud banging sound from the other side of the house. It sounded like someone hitting the siding with their hand. Even Uncle Ben looked genuinely frightened now, which only heightened my fear. We all went back inside and locked the door. Aunt Mel ran around the house, shutting all the curtains and blinds. We felt like we were being watched. Uncle Ben did something completely out of character. He called the police. He hated involving them in anything, but the situation had escalated too far. While we waited, a loud bang shattered the tense silence. It came from the kitchen, where a window had been broken. Aunt Mel screamed, and Uncle Ben yelled for someone to get the old rifle from the closet. But it hadn't been loaded in years. Thankfully, the police arrived quickly. The sound of the sirens seemed to scare off whoever was outside. One of the officers found a brick lying on the kitchen floor with a note attached. The message read, "Leave now." The next morning, we noticed Uncle Ben's Trump flag, which he had displayed on his porch, was missing. We began to suspect the motives for the attack might have been political. To this day, we don't know why our Thanksgiving was targeted. Whether it was a political statement or a random act of intimidation, one thing is certain: there are truly sick people out there.